Hi, folks. I'm Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, the author of two books of contemporary Indian military history titled India's Wars, a Military History from 1947 to 1971. That was published in 2016 by HarperCollins. And its sequel, uh, Full Spectrum India's Wars from 1972 to 2020, which was published again by HarperCollins very recently in October 2020. I'm delighted to be speaking at the Pondicherry Lit Fest. Though, to be honest, I would have preferred to speak with the mild noise of the waves from the Arabian Sea uh, accompanying our dialogue. But then that was not to be. And therefore, I think we all have to make do with changes in our lives caused due to the COVID 19. And so here I am dialoguing with you on a virtual platform on an issue that is very close to my heart and that I feel should be an intrinsic element of contemporary Indian history, and that is India's military history since independence. Uh, so I thought I'd dialogue with you this morning on contemporary Indian military history through the lens of my own personal journey that has taken me across several challenges and several milestones as I transited from a career as a professional airman, a fighter pilot, an Air Force officer, uh, to an academic and a military historian. Uh, Military history has always fascinated me from the time I was a child. Arjuna, Achilles, Napoleon, Patton, and our own General Thimaya were my heroes. And the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and later on in life, a little bit about the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides. And so I've grown up with military history. Uh, and then came my Air Force career. So for about 25 years, I remained an amateur military historian, lapping up military history as it was written from across the world. John Keegan, Sir Michael Howard, Lawrence Friedman, uh, Russell Weigley from the United States. These are all legendary military historians whose works I read through my service career. And I had this yearning at the back of my mind that I think someday I must write contemporary Indian military history. Now, writing military history in India after independence has not been an easy proposition. And let me explain why. Military history in independent India was more seen as a forgettable legacy of our colonial past, and therefore was seen as a sideshow. And many historians in independent India preferred to concentrate on political, social, economic, and even ecological history. And the academic discipline of military history actually completely fell by the wayside. Now, it's not just that there was an academic neglect of military history, but there was also an institutional neglect of military history. And that institutional neglect came from our reluctance to introspect and to declassify military operations that would then be studied by academics and historians to come up with lessons learned and to build up a repository of military history. Uh, I then was an Air Vice Marshal in the Indian Air Force in 2012, and I felt that life was slipping by, and I had this idea of putting together a military history of contemporary India that fused in operations of all the three services. And that is the Army, the Indian Air Force, and the Indian Navy. And that's how India's wars, a military history from 1947 to 1971, was born. It took me about 4 years to write the book. And then when the book came out in 2016, I realized that I had to get down to the sequel immediately. Or else, whatever momentum I had gathered during the writing of India's wars and the extremely surprising and positive manner in which it was received by a broad spectrum of readership in India, I said I must do the sequel sooner than later. Because the sequel deals with a period when many of us have seen war and conflict either directly as participants or as bystanders. And I felt that I was ideally positioned, having been on the inside when momentous events have taken place in the conflict spectrum in India, and that it would be a shame if I did not chronicle it in a broad and honest appraisal of war and conflict in contemporary India. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the backdrop in which I wrote this book, Full Spectrum India's Wars 1972 to 2020, that we are actually talking about today. So what is Full Spectrum all about? Full Spectrum is a fast-paced, easily narrated, and yet accompanied by robust academic research and flavor that makes it a military history offering that would be acceptable to a wide constituency of readers. So whether you're a policy maker or a military officer, or even a lay reader who wants to know more about India's armed forces, then I think Full Spectrum India's Wars from 1972 to 2020 is your go-to book. So what's the landscape I cover in the book? The landscape I cover in the book is huge. And when I set out to write the book, a number of well-wishers told me, look, Arjun, you are biting off more than you can chew. How in the blazes will you be able to fit the entire landscape of war and conflict over these last almost 50 years, 72 to 2020 is about 48 years, into one volume? And how big are you going to have that volume? That volume can't be bigger than your first book, India's Wars. So I said, look, it's a challenge. I don't think I have the appetite to do a 3-volume series. And hence, I think it would be best if I were able to compress the residual part of India's wars and conflicts into another volume right up to 2020. So how did I go about that? The book is sort of laid out into slightly over 20 chapters. What I do is that I do not presuppose that the reader of Full Spectrum India's Wars 1972 to 2020 should have or must have read my first book, which is India's Wars from 1947 to 1971. So I needed to provide a takeoff point for readers should they choose to commence their investigation and analysis of war and conflict in contemporary India from 1972 onwards. So I introduced the reader to 2 chapters that I call Building Military Capability and Chameleon Wars. And what I do in these chapters is that I lay the foundation for an examination of war and conflict through its changing perspectives over the last few decades. Now, what has happened is that the character of war and conflict have changed significantly, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War. And we have now wars of different shades and colors, other than the conventional war that we were used to looking at in the World War II or the post-World War II era. So I introduced the reader to things like hybrid wars, proxy wars, subconventional conflict, what is terrorism, and the likes of it, so that the reader understands the contours of conflict that I'm going to talk about in the following chapters. I also introduced the reader to how the Indian armed forces have developed over the last 40 to 50 years, what kind of capability it has, what are its constituents, how is it formed, how does it fight different kinds of wars, and whether it is equipped to fight wars of the future. And then I start my narration. Largely, my narrative follows a chronological sequence. There are a couple of operations that I've written about in this book that actually would have fitted into the earlier book. But because of paucity of space and because I just couldn't leave them out, I've included them in this book. For example, the 1967 face-off at Nathula, which assumes so much of importance today, is covered in this book. Similarly, the origins of the Naga insurgency can be traced back to the 1950s. So I've included a portion of it in this book and then continued as the Naga rebellion has festered into what is probably the longest insurgency in the post-World War II era. So my narrative moves from the insurgencies in the northeast. They land up at the Golden Temple in Amritsar, where Operation Blue Star was conducted by the Indian Army with very dire consequences. India's successes in Siachen are written in two extensive chapters with several interviews from many of the stalwarts who have participated in the operations. From Siachen, I move on to the Indian peacekeeping force intervention in Sri Lanka, wherein India's armed forces learned a lot of lessons and did not perform as well as it anticipated in the face of a deadly insurgent and terrorist outfit, the LTT. In fact, the lungi-clad fighters, as the Indian Army initially liked to call the LTT, taught the mighty Indian Army a lesson or two in counterinsurgency operations. A lot was learnt. Several people called India's intervention in Sri Lanka as India's Vietnam, but I wouldn't go so far because I think India's intervention in Vietnam did lay the blueprint for the final defeat of the LTT almost 2 decades later at the hands of the Sri Lankan army. One of India's spectacular successes in overseas interventions was Operation Cactus, wherein India's armed forces responded to an SOS call from President Gayoom to foil a possible coup. And then I move on to 2 comprehensive chapters on the Kargil conflict. Now, I had a challenge when I had to write about Kargil. Lots and lots has been written about Kargil, but they've been primarily written by practitioners who fought in the conflict, and therefore those accounts are either journalistic accounts or they are accounts by practitioners who had a stake in the entire conflict. And I felt that it was time to look at the Kargil conflict for what it was. The first of its kind, a high altitude conflict that saw India being initially surprised but fight back with ferocity and ultimately deliver a strategic outcome that was akin to a decisive victory. But several mistakes were made along the way. Several lessons were learned. Many of them which we are at times reluctant to acknowledge. So what I've put together in my Kargil chapters is a holistic and a very honest appraisal of the Kargil conflict. And I must reiterate that while writing the Kargil chapter, I had the deepest of respect for all those who fought in that conflict. And my attempt is to blend a record of that raw courage, with an honest analysis of some of the mistakes made. Now, if you were to ask me, which is my favorite chapter in the book, right? My favorite chapter in the book is called Standing Up to the Dragon. And I think the Standing Up to the Dragon is a chapter that looks very critically and very deeply at the Nathula incident that took place in 1967 and the face-off between the Indian Army and the People's Liberation Army at Sumdorongchu in Arunachal Pradesh in 1986 and 1987. And why these chapters have really been my favorite chapters is because these chapters highlight the first instance when the Indian armed forces really stood up to the Chinese and convinced the Chinese that the Indians are no longer going to be a pushover as compared to 1962. My book also covers the entire landscape of skirmishes, face-offs, and encounters across both the line of actual control with China and the line of control with Pakistan, including several cross-border strikes that were carried out into Pakistan, called the surgical strikes and the Balakot strikes. I also cover the cross-border strikes carried out in Myanmar against elements of the Naga insurgent outfits that were causing a little bit of a mayhem in 2016. I actually end my book, thanks to the COVID pandemic. My book got delayed by about 5 to 6 months, and that gave me time to include significant elements of the ongoing face-off in eastern Ladakh between the Indian Armed Forces and the People's Liberation Army right up to June 15th, when the fierce clashes in the Galwan Valley took place. Now, I'm immensely satisfied with the way the book has come out. And I'm also delighted with the initial reader feedback that I have got. And what I'm happiest about is not that it's the military that has embraced the book. It is the young reader who has enjoyed reading the book, even though it is a voluminous 450 pages plus. So I think in that way, it's a mission accomplished. These two books have given the Indian reader deep insights into India's armed forces like have never been offered before. Because as a practitioner and the lack of classification, I think I've been able to sort of infuse a sense of honesty, a sense of balance, a sense of exciting anecdotes that makes it a wholesome offering. I wish, again, that I could have spoken about the book amidst the salubrious environment of Pondicherry, but maybe next year. Maybe the book continues attracting attention through 2020, and I hope I can, through 2021, and I hope I can come back in 2022 to tell you, hey guys, the book is still relevant, and I'll be glad to talk to you about it. Thank you very much for a patient listening, and I hope you enjoy the book as much as I've enjoyed writing them. Thank you, and bye-bye.